Welcome back to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Today, we're going to be tackling a challenge. I think that's pretty familiar to any officer who's been deployed on an international mission.
Okay.
How do you make the biggest impact when resources are always limited?
That is the question, isn't it? It's a constant balancing act. And it's where that skill of objective setting and prioritization, it just becomes absolutely crucial.
Right, because we can't do everything at once.
Yeah.
So how do we choose where to focus these capacity building efforts?
Well, that's where the CBD objective prioritization chart comes in. It's a tool that helps us systematically score and rank potential objectives and really ensure that we're focusing on the most impactful ones given the specific context of our mission.
Okay, let's unpack this chart a little bit. What's the basic idea behind it?
It's essentially a matrix with different categories, representing kind of various factors that contribute to an objective's importance. We score each objective across these categories, and then the total score gives us a clear picture of its priority level.
Well, higher scores mean higher priority.
Precisely.
What kind of categories are we talking about? Give us some examples.
Well, some categories focus on the strategic impact of an objective. For example, how does it relate to core policing practices? Does it contribute to human rights protection? These strategic categories are weighted more heavily because they really align with those broader goals of international policing.
Makes sense. We want our efforts to be aligned with that big picture.
Absolutely. Then we have categories that assess the feasibility and practicality of an objective. Things like risk, how challenging will it be to achieve this objective? Or implementability, do we have the necessary resources and capacity to carry it out?
So it's a holistic assessment, looking at both the strategic value and the practical considerations.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see how this could be really useful in the field.
Yeah, it's designed to be a very practical tool for officers on the ground.
So let's say hypothetically we're deployed to Galasi,
Mm-hmm.
and we're working with their criminal investigation service, their CIS. How would we use this prioritization chart to guide our capacity building efforts?
Okay. So let's imagine one of our objectives is to improve the Galasi CIS's capability to investigate cases of sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV.
It's certainly a critical area.
So let's plug this objective into the prioritization chart and see how it scores.
All right, walk me through it.
Okay. So first we look at the strategic categories. We've already mentioned policing practice and human rights. And clearly, this objective scores high in both. Addressing SGBV is absolutely fundamental to effective policing, and it's also fundamental to protecting human rights.
Right. It's hard to argue against that.
Exactly. And depending on the specific context in Galasi, this objective might also score high in other strategic categories.
Okay, so we're already seeing how this objective aligns with the broader goals of our mission.
Precisely. Now let's move on to the practical categories. Risk. Well, there might be some challenges in improving SGBV investigations. So let's give it a moderate risk score. Implementability. Again, it depends on the capacity of that Galasi CIS. But let's assume for now it's reasonably achievable with the right support.
And what about donor interest? Is there funding available for this type of initiative?
Well, addressing SGBV is often a very high priority for donors, so we could likely expect strong support there.
So overall, it sounds like this objective is shaping up to be a high priority.
That's right. It's really ticking a lot of the boxes in terms of strategic alignment, feasibility, and that external support.
This is really insightful. I'm starting to see the power of this prioritization chart.
It forces us to think very systematically about our objectives, weigh different factors and make informed decisions about where to really focus those limited resources.
Now, I'm curious, could we compare this SGBV objective with another potential objective, just to see how they kind of stack up against each other?
Absolutely. Let's look at another objective that was mentioned in some of our briefing materials for the Galasi CIS, digitalizing their work processes.
Interesting. How does that score on the chart?
Well, first, let's consider those strategic categories again. Digitalization certainly contributes to efficient policing, so it would score some points there, but it might have the same level of impact on human rights as addressing SGBV.
Right. It's less of a direct link.
Exactly. And then when we move to the practical categories, digitalization might score high in implementability if the Galasi CIS is technologically ready. But donor interest might be lower compared to that SGBV objective.
So we're starting to see a difference in priority between these two objectives.
Yes. Even though both of those objectives are valuable in their own right, the prioritization chart helps us understand their relative importance within the specific context of our mission in Galasi.
This is fascinating. It's like we're using data to drive our decision-making, rather than just relying on gut feeling.
Exactly. The chart brings a level of objectivity and transparency to that whole process of objective setting and prioritization.
Okay, so we've scored these objectives. We've identified a potential priority. But how do we make sure those objectives are well-defined and actionable?
That's where the SMART approach comes in. Each objective needs to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
I've heard of SMART goals before. Could we apply that to our Galasi example?
Absolutely. Let's take that objective of improving SGBV investigations. Instead of just saying, improve SGBV investigations, which is quite vague, we need to make it much more specific and measurable.
Give me an example.
A SMART objective might be, increase the number of SGBV cases investigated and successfully prosecuted by the Galasi CIS by 20% within the next 2 years.
Okay, so let's break that down. It's specific because it identifies the key outcome, increasing the number of cases investigated and prosecuted. It's measurable because we have a target, a 20% increase. It's achievable, assuming there's a realistic pathway to achieve that increase within the given resources and context. It's relevant because it directly addresses that priority of improving SGBV responses. And it's time-bound because we have a time frame, 2 years.
Precisely. That's a well-defined objective. It provides a clear roadmap for action and evaluation.
And we could do the same for digitalizing work processes.
Of course. A SMART objective for that might be implement a digital case management system for the Galasi CIS within 18 months that reduces case processing time by 15%.
Again, we have that specificity, implementing a digital system. Measurability, reducing processing time by 15%. Achievability, relevance, and a clear time frame.
Exactly. By phrasing our objectives in this way, we create that foundation for effective planning, implementation, and monitoring.
This has been a fantastic breakdown of objective setting and prioritization.
Yeah.
And I think the Galasi case study has really brought these concepts to life.
I agree. It's always helpful to see how these frameworks play out in those real-world scenarios.
Yeah, and even though this is a hypothetical example, it highlights the complexities and considerations that officers face in the field.
Absolutely. Every mission, every host nation presents such unique challenges and opportunities. And then that's why these tools and frameworks are so valuable.
They provide a structured approach to navigating that complexity.
Precisely. And they empower officers to make informed decisions that maximize the impact of their capacity building efforts.
So as we kind of wrap up this part of our discussion, what key message would you leave our listeners with?
I would emphasize that objective setting and prioritization are not just bureaucratic exercises. They are essential processes that drive effective and sustainable capacity building.
It's about being strategic, intentional, and making the most of limited resources.
Exactly. By using tools like that prioritization chart and embracing the SMART approach, officers can ensure that their efforts are aligned with the needs of the host nation, the priorities of the mission, and ultimately contribute to building a more peaceful and secure world.
That's a powerful message, and one that's relevant to every officer working in the international policing arena.
Absolutely.
Thank you again for sharing your expertise today. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. Always happy to discuss these critical issues.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the International Policing Podcast on Capacity Building and Development. We encourage you to reflect on the concepts we've discussed today and consider how they might apply to your own work in the field. We'll be back soon with another episode exploring the latest trends and challenges in international policing. Until then, stay safe and stay engaged.